It is Sarah Carpenter. It is a chilly day here in the Tetons. Hopefully we'll have some folks joining us. Welcome to Live with the American Avalanche Institute. We've been trying to do these once or twice a week for folks, recognizing that ski areas are shut down. Some folks who are new to backcountry travel are out in the backcountry. Some folks who are experienced in backcountry travel are still out there. And we're just trying to connect with folks, have a conversation about the world of snow and avalanches, encourage everyone to think long and hard of if you are going into the backcountry, think as a community member, really remember that if anything happens to you and search and rescue has to respond, you are putting a lot of people at risk. You're exposing a lot of people potentially to the coronavirus or any other, avalanche terrain, any other threats. So if you are traveling in the backcountry right now, think long and hard about where you're going, take some steps back, and just proceed with caution. And today, what I really want to spend some time talking about is the human factor, or risk tolerance, how we deal with our partners, what we do in the backcountry in terms of communication, teamwork, all of that. And I think a lot about, when I think about the human factor, it's this phrase that doesn't always clarify exactly what we're talking about. And what I think about is, how do our natural tendencies influence our behaviors in the backcountry or wherever? This doesn't have to just apply to backcountry travel. And one of the interesting questions, at AAI, we do staff training every year, and we've got this amazing pool of experienced folks. And we were talking about the human factor and how to communicate, thinking about how we interact with our environment and our partners. And one of our instructors, Doug Workman, asked, really, let's talk about risk tolerance. And what's your risk tolerance? And there's a lot of ways to define your risk tolerance. And I thought one of the most profound questions was actually, if you're learning a new thing, how do you approach it? Do you completely just throw yourself in and get pummeled? Let's say surfing. I live in a landlocked zone and I'm learning to surf, and I really love it. And the question of, if you're going to learn to surf, do you just rent a board and throw yourself in and get pummeled and figure it out? Or do you gather all the information that you can, study the ocean, take some lessons, and then slowly tiptoe your way into the ocean? And I thought that was a really great question about how to figure out your risk tolerance, because those folks that are willing to just jump in, throw yourself in, often what that can translate to is a much higher risk tolerance than folks who have a tendency to gather a bunch of information for backcountry skiing, take some avalanche courses, buy the gear, spend a ton of time learning, and then tiptoe out into the backcountry in mellow terrain, and then getting bigger and bigger. I see someone saying, send it. I think we all have different tendencies, right? Some of us are really willing to just get out there and go for it, and some of us aren't. And recognizing in the world of snow and avalanches, where we have this environment where we're not always getting good feedback of if we made good decisions or if we just got away with it, that high risk tolerance could potentially put us in more exposed terrain quicker, and potentially get us into trouble. But I thought that was a great way to think about risk tolerance. What do you do when you're learning a new skill? And then recognizing that this world that we're operating in terms of traveling in the backcountry is just a really hard environment to just throw yourself into. When we talk about the human factor, there's been some work years and years ago. A guy named Ian McCammon did some work on identifying human factors, basically things that influence our decisions, and what those can influence us to do. He came up with this acronym called FACETS. If you've been around the world of avalanche education for a while, you have heard it over and over again. But what FACETS mean is, the F stands for familiarity, and the more familiar you are with the terrain that you're traveling in, you have a tendency to expose yourself to more risk factors or more obvious signs of instability, avalanching, collapse, collapsing, shooting cracks, an obvious avalanche path. Then if you are traveling in unfamiliar terrain, we tend to take a mellower approach, take a step back, expose ourselves to less hazards in non-familiar terrain versus familiar terrain. The A for facets stands for acceptance. And his study, which is dated, but what he looked at was mixed gender groups versus single gender groups. And he found that those mixed gender groups actually tended to expose themselves to more hazards versus single gender groups. And the single gender groups he looked at were males, just because there wasn't that much data about single gender female groups. But that's acceptance. So trying to be liked by the group and willing to expose yourself to more hazard in terms of shooting for that acceptance within a group. C is commitment, and that means that we're more likely as a user group to expose ourselves to more obvious hazards, signs of instability, obvious avalanche paths, if we walk out the door with a goal in mind. If I'd flown all the way to Jackson in order to ski the Middle Teton, I'm more likely to expose myself to more obvious signs of instability than if I walk out the door and I'm going on a ski tour and I'm like, oh, let's see what we find. Let's aim in this direction, but there's 8 different places that we can go, and we can adjust based on what we see out there. So the more goal-oriented we are, the more likely we are to expose ourselves to more obvious hazards. E is the expert halo, so a tendency to defer to the expert in the group and not wanting to rock the boat. If you might see something, but you're like, well, I mean, Sarah's been traveling in the backcountry for a long time. I'm just not going to say something because I must be wrong. She must know what's going on. When in fact, we can all miss something. So it's worth speaking up. T is tracks, and meaning that we are more likely to expose ourselves to more hazard if there's tracks on the slope versus if it's an untracked slope. And S is scarcity, meaning we're more likely to expose ourselves to places where there's no tracks and we're striving for it. So it's sort of that you sort of end up in a pickle in either of those. But facets has been one way that we talk about the human factor in terms of factors that are present that might influence our decision-making in the backcountry. And I think it's one useful tool and can be used as a double check of like, hey, what are we missing when we're up on the top of a slope? Another interesting take on what influences our behavior and what human tendencies we as individuals might have that influence our behavior was done by this guy named Ken Wiley, who is a Canadian ski guide. He published an article in sort of the Avalanche journal. It's called the Avalanche Review, or TAR, that the American Avalanche Association puts out. And this was a couple of years ago, but he published an article on the 7 dragons. It's sort of based around the 7 deadly sins. And the premise is that he read a book that influenced him to think about the way that we our natural tendencies might influence our decisions and our risk tolerance out in the backcountry. And the 7 dragons that he listed, and I'm going to read them, I have some piece of paper down here, were arrogance, self-deprecation, impatience, martyrdom, greed, self-destruction, and stubbornness. And the interesting thing is that you can have a natural negative tendency, negative association with all these words. But if you think about it, arrogance can actually be a positive thing in terms of confidence. And if you have the confidence to speak up if you see something that's not right, that actually can be a really great trait. Where it can get in your way is if you're being a jerk or if you're so confident that you're not actually listening to anyone else and just pushing forward. Or impatience can be beneficial if you're focused on efficiency and you're a focused worker, and where it can be a detriment is cutting corners. But I thought this was a pretty interesting take in terms of these. Out of these 7 things, each of us naturally leans towards 1 or 2 of them. And in certain contexts, they can be quite positive, but taken to an extreme, they can actually be detrimental. So it's worth maybe looking up the article. I'll try and post it on our Facebook page and check it out and do some thinking in terms of what your natural tendency is and how it might influence your decision-making. The interesting thing, I was talking to one of the other AAI owners, my husband, Don, and we were talking a lot about the human factor and our natural tendencies and communication issues being one thing, but really an important piece to all of this is who your partners are and what their tendencies are and and if they're going to actually listen. So we had a long conversation about a good partnership and what do good partners in the backcountry look like, and how do you build those partnerships? And for me, what I think about a lot of the people that I'm going to ski, expose, committing terrain with, I want to know that I can comfortably communicate with them, even in high stress environments. And I want to know that they're willing to listen to me. So if I make a point that's valid and I have concerns, that they're willing to turn around and head out or shift to a different objective if I have concerns. So the big question for me with partners is, can you communicate with them? Do they take what you're saying and actually consider it and potentially shift their decisions, or do they just say, yeah, we're fine, just push on through? And to me, those partners that are like, yeah, we're fine, let's just push on through, are not the partners that I actually spend time in the backcountry with. If I do, I might choose to ski really low angle, non-committing terrain in order to not get myself into trouble with those folks. With all of this, really what we're trying to identify is what natural tendencies, what behaviors influence your decisions, and how can you control those and manage them in the backcountry so that you give yourself enough margin and not get yourself in trouble. And one of the things that we do on courses, and that we've all actually asked our whole staff to do, and what we've done as individuals, is think about identifying our own personal disaster flags, or PDFs. What we think about with these personal disaster flags is think about near misses, close calls, accidents that you had. And these can be in the backcountry, but they can also be just everyday life. Or if you're a big mountain biker, those close calls or near misses that have happened when you've mountain biked, or when you're surfing, or any of those other sports that you like to do. Think about near misses, close calls, and accidents, and identify different group dynamics or human factors that influenced that accident or near miss or whatever it was. And the important thing is to think about more than one accident or more than one near miss, because the next question is, with all of these human factors that may have influenced, or group dynamics, weird communication that may have influenced and may have led to this close call or accident, is there a theme throughout these incidents? Do I tend personally to expose myself to more risk when I have a goal in mind? Is that my Achilles heel? So the goal with this, with thinking about near misses or accidents in whatever sport or whatever activity you do, is think about what influences your decision making throughout and what's your Achilles heel. I have a good friend who has the expert halo, and he's quite confident that he can escape avalanches. And that's sort of his Achilles heel. My Achilles heel is definitely, I am a goal-oriented person. So when I go out with a goal in mind, I'm much more willing to push through obvious signs of instability, discomfort, any concerns, than if I don't have a goal in mind. And knowing my personal disaster flag and knowing my partner's personal disaster flags is really important, because when I think about having good partners in the mountains, I also think about balancing out my Achilles heel. And if my Achilles heel is I'm really goal-oriented and I am more vulnerable when we go out with a goal, the last thing I want to do is have all my partners be the same goal-oriented people willing to expose themselves to more hazards when we walk out the door with a goal. I want to think about balancing myself out. And that friend who has high confidence that he's an expert and can escape avalanches, he's also not vulnerable to that goal-oriented Achilles heel, or that goal-oriented factor. And so he and I actually travel in high consequence terrain together because we balance each other out. So think about that a lot in terms of who you're traveling in the backcountry with. And really, when I think about the human factor, I really think about partners and finding someone to balance me out. Years ago, my husband was cutting firewood, and someone drove by and asked him how the huckleberries looked. And he was like, oh no, there's no huckleberries. And he'd been cutting firewood for like an hour in this zone. And once someone asked him about the huckleberries, as he walked back to the rest of the firewood, he saw that the huckleberries were everywhere, and he just hadn't seen them because he wasn't looking for them. So know what you're most vulnerable for in terms of how you walk out the door and what's going to influence your decision, and then build partners that are able to look for things that you might not be looking for, that can balance out your views and your opinions. And so hopefully we can all catch something that someone else might miss. That's mainly what I think about with human factors. Really, my end goal is understanding myself, understanding where I'm vulnerable, and then finding partners that are going to balance me out, that are going to offer more expertise, and add dimensions to what I'm seeing. And I did see a question a little while ago about whether or not people should be traveling in the backcountry right now or not. I have chosen to not travel in the backcountry right now based on the coronavirus, and thinking about not wanting to tax the medical system. That in Idaho is actually, in Victor, Idaho, it's pretty quiet here. But I don't want to be one that walks into the hospital at this time. Other folks have chosen to ski. We're not taking a hard and fast stance, but what I will say is, if you are choosing to travel in the backcountry, really think like a global citizen, think about your community, and really take a couple steps back and recognize that if you do get hurt, if you do get avalanched, the potential impact on your community is not just you getting injured or killed, but it's also impacting that search and rescue resources. So that's sort of our stance on this. We are trying to do more of these Instagram lives. We would love input on what folks are interested in seeing. If you are craving more continuing education, we are posting these live events on our Facebook page, and they're also on our Instagram live for the next 24 hours. We have an awareness course on avalanchecourse.com if you're interested. And please, please, please send us direct messages on Instagram or on Facebook. Let us know what else you want to cover. We're going to walk through our gear closet on Thursday at 3 p.m., show you what we do end of season in terms of storing our gear, things about that. And let us know what you want to hear from us next week. Thanks for joining us today. Stay healthy and safe. And we'll talk to you later.